Yep, you read the title right. I really do think that most people are going to hate this movie. Or at the very least, a significant amount of them are going to, the same way that a lot of people hated The Last Jedi. And yet, just like with TLJ, I didn't hate Matrix Resurrections. And while I don't love Resurrections the same way I did TLJ, which is my favorite Star Wars movie, I loved some of the things in this movie, and I also hated some of the things here as well. This video talks about all of that, and make sure to check out the timestamp down below if you want to skip around. And finally, feel free to like the video if you find it useful and you want more similar content. You can also subscribe, it's free and you can always unsubscribe later. With that said, I like to end on a positive note, so I'll start with the things that didn't work for me first. Number 1. The fight scenes. If there's one thing that everyone remembers about the originals, whether it's the first movie or the original sequels, it's not the free will versus determinism philosophy that is deeply entrenched throughout the movies, it's the amazingly shot and choreographed fight scenes. You know, bullet time and other stuff like that. And yes, even as someone who was in it more for the philosophy rather than the action, the fight scenes in the original trilogy are all really masterfully shot. Sure, some of them get memed due to the bad CGI, but a recent rewatch convinced me that if nothing else, the second and third Matrix movies have amazing action sequence, even if the context surrounding the fights are not that great. Which is why it's such a whiplash when I saw the fight scenes in Resurrections. A lot of them are not bad, some of them are even okay, but compared to the rest of the series, it's just shit. A lot of them take place in dark places, which isn't necessarily a problem, but when the fights are cut really quickly and shot really shakily, which are like the opposite of the fights in the original trilogy, then it becomes a problem. Some people say that the fights are not the point of the movie or that the fight scenes are bad on purpose, and while yes, I can see both of them being true, it still does not excuse it for me personally. With that said, I think there is one aspect of the fights that is superior to the fights in Reloaded and Revolutions. It's the fact that there is genuine tension in the fights, because here Neo just isn't as overpowered as he was in the previous sequels, which is the only thing about the fight scenes in those movies that really bothered me. Anyway, before I continue, I just want to mention that most of my next points are very much similar to how I think about the works of the author David Mitchell, who co-wrote the script for Resurrections along with Lana Wachowski and Aleksandar Hemon. While I'm not an expert in Mitchell's books, I've read them all at least once, and I used one of his books as my undergrad thesis, and I got an A, which is besides the point. Anyway, some of the things that I loved and also the things that I didn't love about this movie really reminded me of David Mitchell's books, and I think that's worth a mention, I suppose. Okay, anyway, back to the point. Number 2. Logically, the movie can be a bit hard to follow. Now, I don't think there's anyone who would deny that the plot of the first 3 Matrix are not the easiest to follow. Between the philosophical nature of it and also all the jargons or technobabble sprinkled in the script, you really have to pay full attention. And both the philosophical nature and also the jargons are basically even more apparent in Resurrections, which is both good and bad. I will explain the good later, but it's bad to me because there are some points where it seemed like the characters were speaking in nothing but technobabbles or jargons that don't really mean anything, so it's just difficult for me to know exactly what is going on plot-wise or logic-wise because I just cannot parse what they are saying through all the jargons. To connect it with the whole David Mitchell thing, this happens in pretty much most of his books. I have no idea why things are happening the way they are, and yet I still like it anyway because of a reason that I'm going to talk about later on. This isn't a big deal for me personally, but this is probably one of the biggest reasons why most people will not like this movie, and I completely understand that. It's just that my personal preference of this particular aspect of storytelling isn't that high, which leads me to the things that I actually liked about this movie. Number 1. The meta aspect. Earlier, I said something about how the philosophical nature of this movie is still there, and probably more so than how it was in the trilogy. However, the thing that people presumably didn't like, which is also the thing that I like, is that Resurrections does not rehash the same topic that the trilogy talked about, or it didn't even really discuss the topics that should be the logical continuation of what the trilogy was about. Instead, it did a hard turn to a topic that is basically about itself. It is literally a Matrix sequel about the studio forcibly making a Matrix sequel, initially without the original creator's blessing. or about how people will throw countless buzzwords in an attempt to make a sequel that is only superficially similar to the original instead of actually trying to understand the original work just because they want to gain the nostalgia points to get as much profit as possible. So yeah, basically, capitalism bad. Jokes aside, I don't think it's really subtle at all, but the way it does it is so blunt that it is just the best possible way they could have done it. I think this metatextual way is the only good way of doing a legacy sequel decades after the original. In some ways, this metatextual aspect does remind me of how The Last Jedi seemingly had weird storytelling decisions just as a fuck you to some portion of the fanbase. The difference here is that while The Last Jedi says that Star Wars is for everyone, Resurrections is Lana saying, "The Matrix is mine." It doesn't belong to the Warner Brothers. Instead, The Matrix belongs to Lana Wachowski. And you know what? I love both of those things. Subverting people's expectations in order to tell a better instead of a safer story that is trying to make a point is something that is more of these legacy sequels should be doing. Although I have to say, when I realized that this metatextual aspect is only mostly present for the first half of the movie, I was very worried that the rest of the movie would fall into the pitfalls of what it's criticizing. In other words, I thought the movie would be exactly what it criticized. I thought it would try to be both subversive like The Last Jedi, while also be nostalgia baiting and superficially familiar to the original like The Force Awakens. But it doesn't do that. Even in the portion of the movie that is not too metatextual, it's still not a cheap rehash of the original, both in style and in content the way Force Awakens is. The movie does not look anything close to the original. It's less rigid and more fluid with the cameras and its movements, and it's not quite as green. So it's not trying to get you to be nostalgic for the originals. In that way, I think that it's still following through the metatextual theme that the first half of the movie was setting up, even if sometimes it's not quite as neat as I wanted it to. I don't know. This, among other reasons, is why I have to rewatch this movie, but for now, I really love how it does this. Number 2. The romance or the emotional resonance. Okay, so one of the major things that stayed from the original trilogy is the romance between Neo and Trinity. That, along with the metatextual element, is one of the major elements of this movie. Like I said before, the meta stuff kinda dropped out of the movie, at least in the obvious ways, about halfway through the movie, and whether or not you like the rest of it really hinges on what you think of Neo and Trinity. In other words, the movie wouldn't work if there was no chemistry between Neo and Trinity. And fortunately, it wasn't just still there, but to me it seemed like it was there more than ever before. Even after like 20 years, I just love how earnest and unapologetic this part of this movie is. This is another part that reminds me of David Mitchell's books. There's always this unwavering sense of positivity and love in his books. Like, even if I don't understand the plot, which happens a lot in Mitchell's stories, it's not that big of a deal for me because of how emotionally resonant the story still is, even without me understanding every minute detail of the plot's logic. For example, if you've watched Cloud Atlas, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about here. Of course, not everyone will like this type of storytelling, and that's okay, that's completely understandable. But I do, and this review is about my opinion, so yeah. While I did already like the movie because of the metatextual elements, for me this part of the movie is what pushes this from just okay to great. Anyway, if you've enjoyed the video so far, you should give it a like and subscribe if you want more similar content. But yeah, in conclusion, a lot of people hate and will continue to hate this movie, and that's perfectly understandable. Despite the fact that in this video I presented 2 things that I didn't like and 2 things that I liked, this isn't a 2.5 out of 5 movie, because the positives really outweigh the negatives in major ways. And that is partly because of just my weird preferences. Which is why I'm giving this a 4 out of 5. Everyone who likes some of the previous Matrix movies should definitely watch it. Just don't expect it to be a cookie-cutter legacy sequel. It's the kind of nuanced and incredibly personal blockbuster that I thought had disappeared from Hollywood basically, but I'm glad it's not. But still, it's probably gonna be the last of its kind in a long time. Anyway, if you want to see what I had to say about the original sequels, then check out this video right here. Anyway, thanks for watching.